They say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. In ancient Israel, no family proved this saying more dramatically than the house of Ahab and Jezebel. While most people know the story of Jezebel, the infamous queen who persecuted prophets and met a violent end, few know about her daughter, a woman who would surpass even her mother's ruthlessness and become the only female ruler in the history of Israel and Judah. Her name was Athaliah, and her rise to power would nearly destroy the very lineage that would produce the Messiah.
Marriage alliance. The year was approximately 870 BC. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah, though related by blood and faith, had been bitter enemies for nearly 60 years. War had devastated both nations, draining their treasuries and weakening their defenses against foreign threats. Into this chaos stepped two pragmatic kings, Ahab of Israel and Jehoshaphat of Judah. These men understood that their mutual destruction served no one's interests except their common enemies, so they devised a solution as old as monarchy itself, a marriage alliance. The bride chosen for this political union was Athaliah, daughter of Ahab and the notorious Jezebel. She would marry Jehoram, son of the righteous king Jehoshaphat of Judah. On the surface, it seemed like a masterful diplomatic stroke, two warring kingdoms united through the bonds of marriage. But in reality, it was a Trojan horse. Athaliah carried more than royal blood in her veins. She carried the spiritual poison that had already corrupted the northern kingdom of Israel. Jezebel had been a Phoenician princess, daughter of the king of Sidon, and she had brought with her to Israel the worship of Baal and Asherah, fertility gods whose worship involved ritual prostitution, child sacrifice, and practices that horrified the followers of Yahweh. Under Jezebel's influence, Ahab had built temples to Baal throughout Israel, appointed hundreds of pagan priests, and systematically persecuted the prophets of the true God. The woman who would throw prophet Elijah into hiding and orchestrate the murder of Naboth for his vineyard had raised her daughter in this atmosphere of religious corruption and political ruthlessness.
The princess comes to Jerusalem. When Athaliah arrived in Jerusalem, she brought more than just her personal belongings. She brought an entire worldview that stood in direct opposition to everything the kingdom of Judah represented. Jerusalem was the city of David, home to Solomon's temple, the place where God had chosen to dwell among his people. For nearly 3 centuries, the descendants of David had ruled from this holy city, maintaining, however imperfectly, their commitment to the worship of Yahweh. But Athaliah had been raised in Samaria, where compromise was a way of life, where foreign gods were welcomed alongside the God of Israel, where political expediency mattered more than spiritual fidelity. The cultural shock must have been immense on both sides. Here was a princess raised in the sophisticated cosmopolitan court of Ahab, known for its magnificent ivory palace and international connections, coming to the more conservative, tradition-bound atmosphere of Jerusalem. Yet Athaliah was not merely a passive bride accepting whatever role was assigned to her. She was her mother's daughter, intelligent, ambitious, and utterly convinced that her way of seeing the world was superior to the narrow religious traditions of her new home. From the moment she entered the palace in Jerusalem, she began working to transform Judah in the image of Israel and in the image of her mother's corrupt legacy.
The corruption of Jehoram. The first casualty of Athaliah's influence was her own husband. Jehoram had been raised by one of Judah's most righteous kings, Jehoshaphat. a man who had sought to follow God's laws and purify the nation's worship. But as the biblical record starkly notes, he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab had done, for he had the daughter of Ahab as his wife, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Under Athaliah's influence, Jehoram began introducing the very practices that had corrupted Israel. Altars to Baal appeared in Judah. The high places that his father had tried to eliminate were restored and expanded. The systematic persecution of faithful priests and prophets began. But Athaliah's ambitions went beyond religious corruption. She understood that lasting change required the elimination of opposition, and in the royal family of Judah, there was plenty of opposition to her radical agenda. The ancient chronicle records a chilling detail. When Jehoram came to power, he killed all his brothers with the sword, and also some of the princes of Israel. This mass execution was unprecedented in Judah's history. Previous succession disputes had been resolved through exile or political maneuvering, not wholesale slaughter. But Athaliah had brought with her the brutal methods that Jezebel had perfected in Israel. The message was clear: anyone who opposed the new order would be eliminated. Athaliah was not interested in ruling alongside potential rivals. She was building a foundation for absolute power, even if it meant wading through the blood of her husband's own family.
The rise to power. Jehoram's reign lasted only 8 years before he died of a horrible disease that the biblical writers interpreted as divine judgment. His son Ahaziah took the throne, but he had been thoroughly indoctrinated in his mother's worldview. Ahaziah was, in many ways, more his mother's son than his father's. While Jehoram had been corrupted by Athaliah's influence, Ahaziah had been raised from birth in her shadow. He had never known a different way of thinking about power, religion, or governance. The biblical record is brutally honest about Ahaziah's character. He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother advised him to do wickedly. Therefore, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, like the house of Ahab, for they were his counselors after the death of his father. Athaliah had successfully created a puppet ruler, her own son, completely dependent on her guidance and counsel. Through him, she wielded the real power in Judah while maintaining the fiction of traditional succession. But Ahaziah's reign would be even shorter than his father's. After only 1 year on the throne, he made a fatal mistake. He allied himself with his cousin Joram, king of Israel, in a war against the Syrians. This decision would set in motion a chain of events that would finally give Athaliah the opportunity she had been waiting for, the chance to seize absolute power for herself.
The opportunity. The catalyst for Athaliah's ultimate power grab came from an unexpected source, a military commander named Jehu, who had been secretly anointed by the prophet Elisha to destroy the entire house of Ahab. Jehu's revolution was swift and merciless. He killed King Joram of Israel, threw Queen Jezebel from a window to be trampled by horses and eaten by dogs, and systematically hunted down every member of Ahab's family he could find. When Ahaziah saw his cousin's bloody end, he tried to flee, but Jehu's forces pursued him. The young king of Judah was mortally wounded in his chariot and died shortly after reaching the city of Megiddo. News of her son's death reached Athaliah in Jerusalem, and she immediately understood both the danger and the opportunity it represented. With Ahaziah dead, the throne of Judah would normally pass to one of his sons, her grandsons. But Athaliah was not interested in serving as regent for a child king. She had watched power from behind the scenes for too long. She had influenced 2 kings, her husband and her son, but had never held ultimate authority in her own right. Now, with the royal line vulnerable and the kingdom in shock from the sudden death of their king, she saw her chance to achieve what no woman in Israel or Judah had ever achieved: absolute rule. The massacre. What happened next was unprecedented in the brutal annals of ancient Near Eastern politics. Athaliah ordered the execution of the entire royal family of Judah, including her own grandchildren. The biblical account is stark in its brevity. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal heirs. Think about the calculated coldness of this decision. These were not distant political rivals or foreign enemies. These were her own family members, babies and children who called her grandmother, young princes who had played at her feet, teenagers who looked to her for guidance and protection. But in Athaliah's worldview, family bonds were secondary to political necessity. She had learned from her mother that power required the complete elimination of threats, regardless of personal cost. The massacre was systematic and thorough. Palace guards, loyal to Athaliah through years of careful cultivation, moved through the royal quarters, killing princes and their attendants, nurses and tutors, anyone who might someday pose a challenge to her authority. By the end of that terrible day, the house of David, the royal line that God had promised would endure forever, seemed to have been wiped from the face of the earth. But in the chaos and carnage, one small detail escaped Athaliah's attention. A baby prince named Joash, son of the murdered king Ahaziah, was not in the royal nursery when the killers came. His aunt, Jehosheba, had managed to hide the infant and his nurse in the temple complex before the massacre began. While Athaliah was eliminating every visible heir to the throne, the true king of Judah was sleeping peacefully in the house of God, protected by a woman's courage and divine providence. The Queen's Reign. With the royal line apparently extinct, Athaliah proclaimed herself Queen of Judah. It was an unprecedented moment in the history of God's chosen people. For the first time, a woman sat on the throne of David, and she was not even a descendant of the promised line. But Athaliah's reign was more than just a political anomaly. It was a spiritual catastrophe. With no opposition remaining in the royal family, she was free to complete the transformation of Judah that she had begun decades earlier. The worship of Baal, which had been introduced gradually during her husband's and son's reigns, now became the official religion of the kingdom. The Temple of Solomon was systematically plundered, its treasures used to build and maintain temples to the Phoenician gods. Ancient records suggest that Athaliah appointed her own priests, established fertility cults throughout the kingdom, and actively persecuted anyone who continued to worship Yahweh in the traditional manner. For 6 years, Athaliah ruled with an iron fist, supported by a network of officials who owed their positions to her favor and who had participated in her rise to power. Her reign was marked by the same ruthless efficiency that had characterized her mother's influence in Israel. But there was one place her authority could not penetrate: the temple complex, where the high priest Jehoiada maintained the traditional worship of Yahweh and protected the secret that would ultimately destroy her. During those 6 years, as Athaliah consolidated her power and transformed the kingdom, a little boy grew up in the shadow of the temple altar. Joash learned to walk in the sacred courts, learned to speak from priests who remembered the old ways, learned about his heritage as the rightful king of Judah. And when he turned 7 years old, Jehoiada decided it was time to restore the house of David to its rightful place. The downfall. The revolution that ended Athaliah's reign was as carefully planned as her own rise to power had been. Jehoiada, the high priest, spent months preparing, secretly contacting military commanders, foreign mercenaries, and temple guards who had remained loyal to the traditional order. On the appointed day, these conspirators surrounded the temple complex and proclaimed 7-year-old Joash as the rightful king of Judah. The boy who had been hidden for 6 years was suddenly revealed as the living heir to David's throne. When Athaliah heard the noise of celebration and shouting from the temple, she came to investigate, probably expecting to find some religious festival that she could suppress or co-opt for her own purposes. Instead, she found her worst nightmare, a child wearing the crown that she had worn for 6 years, being acclaimed by crowds who were chanting, "Long live the king!" The biblical account captures her shock and rage. Quote, "Now when Athaliah heard the noise of the escorts and the people, she came to the people in the temple of the Lord. When she looked, there was the king standing by a pillar according to custom, and the leaders and the trumpeters were by the king. All the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. So Athaliah tore her clothes and cried out, 'Treason! Treason!'" End quote. But it was too late. The conspiracy was too well organized, the support for the boy king too widespread. Jehoiada gave orders that Athaliah should not be killed within the temple complex. Even in revolution, the house of God must not be defiled with blood. So they escorted her to the palace, to the very throne room where she had ruled for 6 years, and there she was executed for her crimes against the royal family and the kingdom. The legacy of evil. Athaliah's death marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in the history of Judah. But her legacy lived on in the institutions she had created, the officials she had appointed, and the religious practices she had introduced. One of young King Joash's first acts was to organize the systematic destruction of the temple of Baal that Athaliah had built in Jerusalem. The altars were torn down, the idols were smashed, and the chief priest of Baal was executed at the altar where he had served. But the spiritual damage could not be so easily repaired. A generation had grown up under Athaliah's rule, learning to worship foreign gods, accepting religious compromise as normal, viewing political violence as an acceptable tool for achieving power. The seeds of corruption that Jezebel had planted in Israel through her daughter's marriage had taken deep root in Judah. Even after Athaliah's death, the kingdom would struggle with the spiritual and political consequences of her reign. From a historical perspective, Athaliah's story reveals the profound influence that marriage alliances could have on ancient kingdoms. What had seemed like a pragmatic solution to political conflict, uniting Israel and Judah through marriage, had instead become a conduit for corruption. The daughter of Jezebel had proven even more dangerous than her infamous mother because she had been given the opportunity to wield power directly rather than merely influence it from behind the scenes. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Athaliah's story is what it reveals about the nature of evil and its transmission across generations. She had not merely inherited her mother's ambition or ruthlessness. She had inherited an entire worldview that valued power over principle, success over righteousness, immediate advantage over long-term consequence. The apple had indeed not fallen far from the tree. In destroying the royal line to secure her own power, Athaliah had nearly accomplished what no foreign enemy had ever achieved, the complete extinction of the house of David.
the providence factor. Yet in the end, Athaliah's story is also a testament to the power of providence and the courage of individuals who choose to resist evil even at great personal risk. Jehoshabe's decision to hide baby Joash was not a calculated political move or a grand strategic plan. It was the instinctive action of a woman who could not bear to see an innocent child murdered for his grandmother's ambition. And Jehoiada's patient protection of the boy king for 6 years, while Athaliah consolidated her power and eliminated her enemies, required a kind of faith and perseverance that few people possess. These ordinary people, acting on their convictions rather than their self-interest, preserved the very lineage that would eventually produce Jesus of Nazareth. Without their courage, the messianic line would have been broken, and the course of human history would have been irrevocably altered. In our modern world, where family dysfunction and generational trauma are widely recognized phenomena, Athaliah's story serves as both a warning and an encouragement. It warns us that evil patterns can indeed be passed from generation to generation, that the sins of parents can profoundly shape their children's choices, that unchecked corruption tends to grow worse rather than better over time. But it also encourages us with the reminder that individuals can choose to break destructive cycles, that courage and conviction can overcome even deeply entrenched evil, that one person's willingness to stand against injustice can preserve hope for entire nations. Athaliah was indeed her mother's daughter, carrying forward Jezebel's legacy of corruption and violence. But Jehoshabe was someone's daughter too, choosing compassion over compliance, risking everything to save a child she barely knew. In the end, the story of the daughter of Jezebel reminds us that while evil may run in families, so does goodness, and that each generation has the power to choose which legacy it will pass on to the next. The only woman to rule Israel had tried to end the story of God's people. Instead, she became a reminder that even the darkest evil cannot ultimately prevail against the light of truth and the courage of those who choose to serve it.